People even questioned my existence. Right. I didn't know I was going to go to Iraq.
I can
crisis.
verify it today for everybody. He does exist. While many look to America to apologize for the past, many are urging the nation to become stronger, to confront a future more dangerous than ever. Our guest today is Arkansas's Tom Cotton, a decorated war veteran, Harvard and Harvard Law grad, and now a United States Senator who's critical of Washington's increasing departure from the Reagan-era doctrines of peace through strength and trust but verify. And who, like the Gipper, dreads more than anything else these 9 words: I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
We give you information, not a panic attack.
I mean, look what's going on. I mean, my God.
This was it. The kids were gonna die.
That time is gone forever.
This is the biggest story in America.
We weren't prepared for this.
Don't you want to speak truth to power?
Toughest thing I ever had to do.
Well, Senator, welcome to the show. It's been a hell of a time here in Washington with all the talk about government shutdowns. You know, you once wrote about the national debt ceiling, that if we didn't increase the ceiling and it led to a temporary shutdown, it would just be like a short-term market correction. So I have to ask you, what's worse for America, a temporary shutdown or continuing to spend and amass the debt we're amassing on the backs of our kids?
It's a very important question on what's Congress has had on our plate for the last few weeks and what probably will be on our plate for the next few months as well. Neither is good. You hate to see the government shut down. The American people deserve to get the services they pay for with their taxes, whether it's access to public parks or passport processing or federal law enforcement or what have you. At the same time, we also have to take stock of where we are as a nation with our national debt. It continues to climb. It's done so under President Obama, then President Trump, now President Biden, since my time in the Congress. Some of that is in programs that are beyond our control on a year-to-year basis. They're not in the so-called discretionary budget. But the discretionary budget has grown pretty large to include the non-defense-related parts of it. And I do think that we need to take stock of where we were, say, before the pandemic and where we are now.
Isn't this something we keep kicking down the road?
Yeah, unfortunately, you start to run out of road. I mean, you can kick the can down the road, whether you're in Congress or whether you're in business or whether you're a student with the paper that's due, but eventually you run out of road. And usually the solution is much more painful at the end. It would be easier for our nation if we could handle the people's business in an orderly fashion and address, probably in some bipartisan basis, if you look at recent history, the growing national debt and the crisis it could create for our children, for the tax burdens they face, for the risk of inflation, for the threats to our national security and what it means for our defense budget now, as opposed to waiting until a moment of crisis. That's been a consistent point I've had in my time in the Congress, first in the House, now in the Senate. It is better to address these things earlier rather than later.
So you talked about a student cramming for a final exam. So probably one of the most parsed theses ever in the history of the U.S. Senate was your thesis from Harvard University. Were you worried about the democracy, as the founders did, that it would fall victim to, human selfishness, right, and greed and self-interest? I know we have a lot of challenges. How do we feel strong moving forward, given what the founders warned us about looking back?
Well, any form of government is prone to those things because any form of government consists of human beings, and we are all fallen. We all have a sinful nature, and any kind of human institution, whether it's a government or a business or a social organization, is also going to represent all of the human frailties, but also all of the greatness that humans are capable of as well. This is part of what Winston Churchill was getting at when he said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
Right.
I have great faith in our government and in the United States, in part because the founders recognized that human frailty, recognized that angels are not going to govern men, that you have to have a government of men who are frail themselves, and therefore they put in safeguards, they put in guardrails, they put in what we call the system of checks and balances in a separate system of separated powers between the president and the Congress and the judiciary, a system of federalism, which is just another way of saying checks and balances. And it's because our founders gave us a well-constructed representative democracy that we have thrived now for 250 years as a nation. If we didn't have that system in place, I think we might go the way of other failed democracies throughout history and across the world.
But are you bullish about democracy moving forward?
I still am, because I have faith in the American people. You know, the Federalist Papers also said that there's a degree of depravity in human nature that causes a degree of circumspection for any system of government. But there's also greater virtues that provides the opportunity or the possibility for self-government. This is Lincoln's message as well. Again, no nation is perfect, no system of government is perfect, because we don't have perfect human beings to make up that government. But I do have great faith in the American people and the choices they make.
So you said one of the prescriptions in your mind of America moving forward confidently, they're kind of, it's like the four corners, right? Indomitable military, energy independence, strong alliances with friends against enemies, and secure borders. Are those the four kind of legs of the table, so to speak?
They're all critically important for American power. Military power, of course, is the foundational power behind everything else. We have a lot of diplomatic, political, economic, financial power, but what underlays it all is our military. That's why the military has to be indomitable. Of course, you have to have secure borders. One of the main things any military does is protect a country's borders. A country is much more than just its borders, but it's hard to be a country if you don't have borders, if you don't protect your borders. I'm reminded of a time when my now 8-year-old son a few years ago was reading a book with me about Winston Churchill in the Who Is or Who Was series. And we turned the page to the Mandate period between World War I and World War II, and Winston Churchill's role in making much of the modern Middle East. And he said, "Daddy, that map is wrong." And I said, "Really, why is that map wrong?" And he pointed at it and he said, "That's not Palestine, it's Israel."
Wow.
And it goes to show you that here's a 6 or 7-year-old kid who'd been doing like flashcards about countries and states and recognized the modern state of Israel on the map and immediately knew it for what it was because of its borders. So if you don't have borders, you really don't have a country. When you think about power or energy independence, it truly powers our entire way of life. And just think about how you put it when the electricity goes off in your own home.
Right.
You don't say, "Honey, the electricity is out." You say, "The power is out." It's literally how we power our way of life. And then finally, when we go out in the world, which is a big place and it's a dangerous place, we can't do any of what we need alone to protect our nation and remain free and prosperous. We've got to remember, over here in the New World, we've only got about 1/8 of the world's population. We've only got about 1/3 of its global GDP. Mm-hmm. We need partners. We need friends. It's great if those partners and friends share a deep historical and cultural and social and linguistic tradition with us, and they share a system of government. That's why the United Kingdom and Israel are probably our two closest friends, or Japan and South Korea, even though they don't share that kind of deep cultural and linguistic and religious history with us, still share our system of government and our people's aspirations. It'd be great if those were all the partners we needed or all the world was like that, but it's not. It's not a church picnic. And therefore, we have to have partners who don't always share our sensibilities. Monarchies like Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Morocco, even sometimes as it's derided as right-wing strongmen. Look at what Ronald Reagan did with so-called right-wing strongmen in places like the Philippines or South Korea, helped defeat Soviet Russia while also helping those countries reform internally and open up their economy and have free and fair elections. And the reason they're willing to do that is because you can do things like give them security guarantees because of your strong military, and you can help them meet their own demands for economic growth. So all these things are critical sinews of American power, and they all kind of work together.
So you were one of the many Americans who responded to service when 9/11 happened. You were inspired to take a complete departure from the path you thought you were on, to join the military, 2 tours of duty, Bronze Star, and all sorts of other honors. But as much as I was impressed by that, I remember reading the story about how you and your team went in the withdrawal from Afghanistan and helped save over 300 American lives and others who were left behind in that deadly mess. What can we learn from that, Senator? What can we learn to do and not to do in not only being a strong enough military power to project strength, but to protect our own.
Well, thank you for that. I certainly wasn't the only American who did that. Thousands of Americans, many who had served in Afghanistan, answered the bell on that. We were in the middle of our August work period at home, so there wasn't much happening in Congress itself. And my staff, some of whom have served in Afghanistan themselves, one of whom was actually in Afghanistan at the airport at the time, was, thankfully able to help remedy some small part of Joe Biden's debacle in Afghanistan. But it really was a debacle, and it's going to stick with us for some time. There was something called the Vietnam effect after Vietnam, especially after the collapse of Saigon in 1975. And it's not a coincidence that Soviet Russia and its allies were emboldened all around the world, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. Just like it's not a coincidence that Vladimir Putin began to build up his forces on Ukraine's border just a few weeks after the last American left Kabul. And Joe Biden can claim it was an extraordinary success. He can claim that it doesn't have that kind of lingering effect, but I promise you that it does. And many countries who look to America as part of that global network of secure alliances begin to question whether America will be there in the future for them. And it's not just happening in third world countries like Afghanistan. It's happening in advanced industrial democracies who worry that if American will falter so easily in a place like Afghanistan, are we really going to stand by our allies, sometimes our treaty allies, if Russia masses on their borders, if China goes for the jugular in Taiwan and perhaps beyond?
I remember the Vietnam effect. I remember the pictures of our withdrawal from Vietnam when people are clinging on to helicopters, the last flights out. It was embarrassing and disheartening. And I think it really affected a whole generation of Americans, if not more. So I want to go on to, you've had a very unique relationship, Senator, with the New York Times. So first, it was a letter you penned from a battlefield, I think, in 2006, where they had written an article that was really endangering not only troops that you were serving with, but innocent Iraqis because of something that was an investigation into the financing of terrorist organizations. And you really kind of gave it to them. And then years later, you wrote this op-ed after the tragedy of George Floyd, where you were saying, one thing we need to do here in America, given all the unrest, the looting, and the violence, is get control. Maybe one thing to consider here is the use of the military, just so we can get back to square one again. And the person who authorized that, the New York Times, was subsequently fired. I think that helped, by the way, the readership on that column. A lot of people read that piece. Why is it that media so often, in trying to be the protectors of knowledge and understanding, only seem to want to go one way?
Well, first, let me say my personal history with the New York Times goes back even a little further than that. The pump was primed for that summer of 2006 episode in December of 2005. So the scene is at Fort Benning at the Army's Ranger School. And I just finished the second 3-week phase of Ranger School, and it was close to the Christmas break. Now, they had told us that, obviously we're going to leave Ranger School for the Christmas break, but we'd been out in the woods for 6 weeks, not any newspapers, any news or anything. But we needed 3 days of rest at the compound before it was safe to let all these sleep-deprived and food-deprived Ranger students drive away. So I was there that weekend, and they brought in newspapers for us, and they turned on the TVs, and we didn't have, Ranger instructors yelling at us to eat faster. And it was that 3-day period in which the New York Times disclosed yet another highly classified program, the so-called terrorist surveillance program, which, like that terrorist financing program in the summer 2006, was fully disclosed and briefed to Congress. It was supported by people like Nancy Pelosi when she was a more junior member on the Intelligence Committee. And I just couldn't believe that the New York Times took it upon itself to decide what should and should not be highly classified. There are plenty of avenues for any whistleblower, in our government who thinks that a government is acting unlawfully to raise those concerns, whether it's through an inspector general or through internal reporting channels or coming to Congress. The New York Times is not one of the authorized avenues for raising those concerns.
Right.
So fast forward to 2006, I saw this movie replaying itself. It got my hackles up, and I sent this letter to the editor to the New York Times. They obviously didn't run it. A conservative blog site called Powerline did run it. Let's just say it becomes something of an internet sensation. People even questioned my existence. Right. I didn't know I was going to go to Iraq and have an existential crisis.
Verify it today for everybody. He does exist. Yes.
And then you fast forward to the summer of 2020. in which you had BLM riots all around the country. And I made a very simple argument then, which remains true today, is if the local police are not able, or in many cases were not allowed, to restore order to the streets, and if a governor was not able or was not willing to call out the National Guard to restore order to the streets, that's why we have the Insurrection Act.
Right.
It's not something we use commonly, but there is clear, long-standing precedent for a president to use the Insurrection Act to put an end to the violence when necessary and to restore order and ensure federal law is obeyed. It happened in Little Rock with the Little Rock Nine, whenever there was resistance to integrating.
That's right.
It happened in Los Angeles under the first President Bush with the Rodney King riots. It's not something you wish to do as a president. I know Donald Trump did not wish to do it, but in the end, we have that law in the books. It's been on the books for more than 200 years to ensure that in cases where local and state authorities cannot or will not restore order, that you protect the most basic right of American citizens, which is the right to actually continue to live a peaceful life in their communities. I didn't even put the headline on it, "Send in the troops." That was the New York Times. As you know, you don't pick your own headline.
Got a lot of
when you
people's
write.
attention.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I've been told that it led to more subscriptions being canceled in a 24-hour period than any time in the New York Times history. I'm very pleased with that. They still to this day have an editor's note appended to it. Not a correction, but an editor's note.
What does it say?
Well, it doesn't cite any factual errors because, believe me, that went through all the New York Times ordinary fact-checking procedures. There is no factual errors in it. It says it does not meet the New York Times standards. And I agree with that. I did not meet the New York Times standard. I far exceeded their normally very low standards.
Right.
The editor who was fired, James Bennett, he actually came in to see me last year and said to me what he since said publicly, which he shouldn't have agreed to that note. He should have stood his ground. He was fired anyway, but he should have gone out with his boots on, and I respect him for that. He was really thrown to the jackals of their workforce by the ownership of the New York Times.
I want to play you a clip having to do with social media and its impact on children. I want to get your reactions to it in a bill that you have authored together with a number of other U.S. senators in an incredible act of common ground and bipartisanship.
It is a tough question every parent faces. At what age should I allow my child to have a smartphone? Well, the reality is more than 50% of kids in the U.S. have one by the age of 11. So let's make sure that we as parents are prepared to deal with everything that comes with the technology, including cyberbullying.
Cyberbullying. So, Senator, you authored this bill together with two liberal Democrats, another conservative Republican. What's in the bill, and why should all of us feel a sense of urgency about addressing this?
Our bill simply says what parents have a right to do in the real world, they should have a right to do in the digital world. So think about all the things that children can't do or they can only do with parental approval, like get a tattoo, for instance. And then there are some things we don't even let minors do, period, whether it's buy a beer or smoke cigarettes or, go into certain kind of adult establishments. Parents should have those same rights in the digital world. So we simply apply the same standards the social media companies say they apply to children, which is no social media under the age of 13. Period. That's what they say their policy is. But right now, as a practical matter, it's not enforceable because it's just a click the button verification. So you'd have to have some kind of real verifiable age verification process, just like we do for, say, paying your taxes at the IRS website or, going to the DMV. States as diverse as California and Wyoming use the same kind of systems. This is easily done from a technological standpoint. And then second, for minors between the ages of 13 until they turn 18, they have to have parental approval to be on social media. Look, there's many concerns in our country about teen mental health.
Yeah.
And the evidence is pretty clear. There was a huge spike in mental health problems, boys and especially girls, roughly about the time you had the widespread proliferation of smartphones and social media. And social media in particular can create a toxic world for teenagers, especially teenage girls. I mean, just think about when we were in school. Sure, you had bullying and you had kids being mean to each other and ostracizing them, but in a limited world and a limited time. So if you were a young girl struggling with mean girls, well, there's only so many mean girls at your middle school, junior high, and high school. And you had to worry between the hours of 8 and 3. Now it's the entire world, and it never stops. It happens on the nights, it happens on weekends, it happens during summer vacation. you aren't forced to go out and socialize and develop bonds that we all have in the real world as opposed to being online all the time. And your parents don't know what you're doing online in many cases, whereas they know if you're playing with Jimmy or Susie at school. They know who their parents are in many cases. They can exert an influence over your direction. All our bill does is says what parents get to do in the real world, they should get to do in the digital world as well.
You hearing from a lot of parents?
I am, and I get almost uniformly positive feedback. And I got to tell you, I'm also concerned about the ubiquity of cell phones, even without social media, just with text messaging,
Right.
for instance. I think it's a positive step in the right direction for kids not to have smartphones until they're teenagers, maybe even until they're in high school. I think it's a smart step in the right direction for schools who don't allow kids to have access to their phones at school. People say that parents object to that. I've got to tell you, I've not yet found a single parent who personally objects to it. They think other parents object to it. But, for most of human history, like kids didn't have ubiquitous access to their parents. And I know people say, well, Johnny forgot his cleats. He can't go to football practice. Like, well, I guess Johnny is going to learn a lesson, isn't he? What is Johnny going to do 3 years from now when he's at a work site and he forgot his steel-toed boots? Is he going to call mommy to bring him the steel-toed boots? I mean, kids need to learn lessons. They need to learn how to fend for themselves. They need to learn how to operate in the world. They need to develop friendships and bonds with real people who are their age without their parents always hovering over them in that setting. But parents need to have a say in social media because of the almost unlimited universe of possibilities to which it exposes kids.
Yeah, because tech has developed algorithms that purposely are kind of
purposely target. They
right,
purposely target.
Right.
I mean, and some of them are particularly bad, like TikTok, which is a de facto arm of communist China. You can get a brand new phone. You can download a brand new TikTok app. And if you tell TikTok that you're a teenage girl, it'll immediately start showing you videos about how to purge after eating or about your body image. If you tell TikTok that you're a teenage boy, it'll immediately start showing you, the most vile and obscene kinds of pornography or violence. These are algorithms that are targeted towards weaknesses, especially of minors who are still developing mentally and psychologically. American social media companies aren't as bad as TikTok, but they still make their money by targeting towards minors in these content that they think is going to generate more interaction. And unfortunately, uplifting videos don't often generate the most interaction. It's videos that inspire anxiety or fear or hatefulness or what have you.
Talk about fear. Given everything that's going on, the indictments against the former president, the indictment against Hunter Biden, the trouble that Senator Menendez is in, there's been an increasing sense in the country that our system of justice is no longer impartial but purposeful in who it's going after and how it's going after them. I want to play you a clip from Representative Victoria Spartz, who was taking on the Attorney General the other day, and what she had to say.
When I came here as a young person, I believed in the value as an American not to be afraid of my government. But I wanted to tell you, and I want to share with you and get your thoughts on that. Are you aware that a lot of Americans are now afraid of being prosecuted by your department? And this is a big problem when people are afraid of their own government.
People are afraid of their own government. We're used to hyperbole and rhetoric on Capitol Hill. I think that hits home with a lot of people.
It does hit home with a lot of people, and there's a healthy skepticism of government built into America's political DNA, if you will. Go back to what we're talking about earlier with the Federalist Papers. Men are not angels, and angels are not going to govern men. You're going to have a government of men who are prone to all the frailties and vices of any person. And the Federalist said, at first you have to ensure the government can control the governed, but second, you have to ensure the government is itself controlled. Right. That's why we have separation of powers and checks and balances. And unfortunately, this Department of Justice in particular has been deeply politicized. And it's not just the high-profile cases against Donald Trump. And remember, as you said, he's the former president, but he's not only, or in this case, primarily the former president. He's the leading candidate of the opposition party. This is the kind of things you expect to see in countries like Brazil or Pakistan, not in the United States of America. It's not just Donald Trump, though, and high-profile politicians. I mean, consider parents in Northern Virginia going to school boards to protest what their kids are being exposed to, and Merrick Garland is sicking the feds on them, comparing them to domestic terrorists. Or the case of the pastor outside of Philadelphia who was arrested in an early morning raid at his home for the grave crime of singing hymns in front of an abortion clinic and protecting his minor child from an obnoxious pro-abortion activist up in his face. A man who was willing to turn himself in through negotiations with his lawyer, but the FBI conducted a raid on his home. When he was put in front of a jury of his peers, he was acquitted after an hour. And to my knowledge, the Department of Justice has still not, let's say, zealously pursued the dozens of examples of vandalism or firebombing against pro-life crisis pregnancy centers. So there's a clear double standard in our Department of Justice right now. But again, the American people deserve a Department of Justice. They deserve an FBI that is not Democrat or Republican, but is effective in enforcing the law in an even-handed fashion.
I grew up with a dad who was very involved in the media side of politics, as did you, but your parents, as I read, were both big supporters of Bill Clinton. I assume you were maybe less so. That must have led to some great and interesting conversations, even to this day.
Well, my parents were very conservative in the kind of cultural, traditional sense, like most Arkansans. Arkansas was a one-party Democratic state, like most of the South, for most of the 20th century and into the 21st century. In fact, we were the last Southern state to really flip from a Democratic state to a Republican state. So when I grew up, politics was all about Democratic primaries, which meant it was more about kind of biography and personality, maybe geography, not about a big clash of ideas. So my parents raised me to love our country, to be patriotic, to want to give back to it. They voted every time the polls were open. As Arkansas has shifted to the right, as Democrats in Arkansas began to reflect more of the Democrats we see in Washington, D.C., most of our state also shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. We still have a lot of Democratic sheriffs, for instance, across the state, but are probably more conservative than most of the House Republican Conference.
Larry Ard was one of your mentors from the Heritage Foundation. He had a comment I read that must have been directed at you. Remarkable human beings have a way of making remarkable preparation. It's another way of saying kind of cool under fire. Is there anything that's happening right now that makes you feel a little less cool, a little bit more riled up that you wish we could do something about?
Well, I try to make other people, notably Democrats, lose their cool rather than lose it myself.
You do a good job of that, by the way.
Yeah. The New York Times lose their cool. You know, some of the things we've talked about here is what generally causes me real anger whenever Arkansans feel they can't trust their own government or that they may be targeted by their government, not just for criminal prosecution, but for heightened regulatory review at their business because they gave, $1,000 to Mitt Romney in 2012 or Donald Trump in 2016 or what have you. When our government is failing at its basic responsibilities, do things like protect our border, and defend our interests around the world. At the same time, it's infringing on the liberties of our people. Yeah, that does get me a little angry. I talk to a lot of Arkansans who share that anger, and one thing I have to tell them is I definitely channel your anger, but in my job in Washington, I've got to stay cool under fire to be effective in getting the results that address what is causing you to be angry. You have to understand that we have some folks up there that have very different points of view than we do here in Arkansas.
Senator, thank you very much for your time. The whole nation thanks you for your service. I think every parent thanks you for doing what you're doing with other members of the Senate to protect our kids and for caring enough about democracy to be willing to fight for it. I wish you all the best, whether the country is going through upticks or downticks, showdowns or shutdowns. It's good to have someone who has an equilibrium and a level keel to take us through those storms.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
Remember to subscribe today and hit the bell so you never miss another episode of the show with that trademark opener from Washington, D.C. It's 13th and Park.